Chris Robertson, welcome to Unfolding.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
So you found yourself in the middle of this Odyssey culture war. You've been studying Homer for quite a few years. You've even taught some courses on it. Most of the internet has decided that Christopher Nolan desecrated the film before it even released. The latest trailer had 800,000 dislikes and counting last time I saw it. You would seem like the natural cause to be leading this effort for the accuracy defenders. But what do you think, now that you've actually seen the film, that they are misunderstanding about what they're trying to protect?
The backdrop to the whole debate surrounding Nolan is a debate surrounding a translation by a woman named Emily Wilson, who I actually have on my shelf behind me here. And Emily Wilson is an avowed and open feminist. When you read her translation, first of all, her writing is very good. She's a very skillful writer. The term that has been used to describe her work for the masses is very accessible. This is a book that's sort of marketed to be a school book for students as their first introduction to Homer. But she makes certain choices that shade the character of Odysseus and Telemachus in ways that differ fairly broadly from the Greek, and not just in any random direction because of what English requires to fit her iambic pentameter meter and everything. But in that feminist direction, like Odysseus is made to be, he's a morally ambiguous character in the Greek. He's got some very positive sides. He's got some things that make more idealistic people sort of question him a little bit. You're like, why are you telling not the truth here? Why are you lying here? But the narrator maintains a very positive descriptive tone of Odysseus through this whole episodes. And she alters that, going so far as to alter one word that describes Odysseus as like wise Odysseus or resourceful Odysseus. She calls him Odysseus, Lord of Lies, in the beginning of chapter 9. Like, that's not what's in the Greek at all. And she adds some lines to Telemachus. She invents the phrase, "it's not fair," for example, which has a very particular tone and color in English. It has a very bratty, entitled kind of sound to it. That's nowhere in the Greek. That's in book 2. Just a million little tweaks like that to bring Odysseus down and to make the Cyclops seem like a misunderstood prelapsarian pastoral victim of colonial interests of the Greeks, basically. And things like that classicists have picked up on, be like, this is not, it's a skillful translation, but it's not an honorable, it's not an honest translation, we can say. Yeah. It's not a good first translation to read. And the critics of Wilson were hit with the most vociferous criticisms of, oh, you just don't like it because she's a woman. It's like, well, Caroline Alexander did a great job with the Iliad. What are you talking about? Even Emily Wilson's Iliad was generally held to be pretty decent, maybe not as good as Caroline Alexander's, but not the same as her Odyssey. There's a few things. There's like the film itself, or in Wilson's case, the book itself, and then there is the contingency in the crowd that is supporting them. Having seen Nolan's film, I think a lot of the people who were worried and critical about it in advance were correct to be critical of it that way. That said, there's a professor from Cape Town University named Richard Whitaker, who in his own criticism of Wilson said, you have to basically divide translations into two sorts. There are academic translations, which are trying to give faithful, serious conveyances of the meaning of the Greek to a modern English audience. And then there are creative translations or adaptations. And that can be anything from a retelling to Epic the Musical, which is coming out soon or out now or something. I don't know. And everything in between. There's all kinds of adaptations that are inspired by the stories that are not trying to be the stories. You look at Troy from 2004. That is not the Iliad. And a lot of people who saw Troy and then read the Iliad were very confused. Where is the Trojan horse? Where is the death of Achilles? Where is all this stuff? That's not what the Iliad's about, That's not a faithful adaptation of the Iliad that is an artistic work of its own that was inspired by the Iliad. And I think there was a lot of confusion about what Christopher Nolan was doing because he called his film The Odyssey. He didn't call it Odysseus, or he didn't call it The Return, to borrow from another movie title, or Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, or something. Watership Down, The Lion King. He called it The Odyssey. And said, okay, there's a certain expectation of fidelity to the story that you expect from that. And people start to get very understandably upset because these are sacred stories. These are stories about who we are, about our past, and about heroes that we cherish. And by heroes, I mean people who gave us the values that we live by today.
Like the archetype of a hero.
Mm-hmm. In the case of the Iliad, literally. I mean, our idea of heroism in the West really comes from the Iliad. That's where that gets fleshed out, really. What is heroism really all about? The Odyssey is a little bit different. But we can still colloquially call Odysseus a hero in the sense of a noble protagonist who is not pursuing the goal of the hero that we saw in the Iliad, but is pursuing his homecoming. He's pursuing his nostos. And I thought what Nolan did as a standalone work of art is in many ways very comparable to James Joyce's Ulysses. James Joyce was probably the consummate literary genius of the 20th century. And he considered Odysseus the most developed character in all of Western literature. He was the rabbit to catch. And Joyce, being a fairly arrogant individual, said, well, I'm going to compete with that. I'm going to create something equal to. And it was a good attempt. It failed. Most people say Ulysses failed to do what it set out to do. Very bold attempt. Very masterful attempt. And I feel like this is comparable in that Nolan is trying to do something that is not the Odyssey, but he's using Odysseus. He's using the story of the Odyssey to make his story about the golden rule, really. But the problem is, in doing so, as with Joyce, he does a lot of violence to the source text. He basically butchers Xenia, and takes a very idiosyncratic theologically grounded custom from ancient Greece, and he turns it into this sort of deontological principle that transcends the gods itself, into like the golden rule, which not only condemns Odysseus, but by extension condemns all mankind, because Odysseus is the stand-in for man, that man, Andra. This will be controversial among classicists who will disagree with me, but I think there's some justification for looking at it in that direction. And because humans are tricky creatures, in many ways, Nolan blames Odysseus for the Bronze Age collapse, for the fall of civilization and the end of the world. It's an apocalyptic world that he's depicting, both in the sense of the end of the world with the collapse of the Bronze Age and the spread of the sea peoples and everything, but also apocalyptic in the sense of a revealing of the cause of the collapse. And it's particularly etymologically funny because we have calypso, the one who covers over, and apocalypse is apocalypse. It's a away from the covering. It's a revealing. But when we look back in the history of Western civilization, Homer is there at the root. And I mean, this is my opinion. It's also for slightly different reasons Friedrich Nietzsche's opinion. He has a wonderful book or essay called Homer's Contest, where he describes the sublimation of Eris, the sublimation of strife from violent conflict into cooperative contest in athletics and in the funeral games and these sorts of things. And that's really what makes civilization possible. Homer is in many ways the author of our civilization. And what Nolan is doing is pointing his finger at Homer and at Odysseus as the cause of the collapse of civilization. It's a very audacious thing to do. And I don't know if people recognize this all consciously, but I think they're picking it up subconsciously in a lot of his, of course, casting choices, the coloring. It was a very dark film. It was not as colorless as I was expecting, but it was very drab. It was very dark. It felt transformed. Circe is no longer a seductive enchantress. She has been transformed, it seems, by the collapse of this world into this old European hag, basically, a classical medieval witch. The Trojan horse, half buried in the sand, I wish I could take credit for observing this myself, is a callback to the half-buried Statue of Liberty in Planet of the Apes. Visually, there's a striking similarity there that is very much intentional and is meant to invoke this sense of the end of the order and everything. And he's doing that with a story that really laid the foundations for civilization, as though our deviation from Xenia, as though our deviation from the law of Zeus, which he calls the golden rule, is the cause of the present condition we're in now. It's like, well, the law of Zeus involves a lot of things, but it begins with hierarchy. The first word of the Iliad is menis, which is, it's often translated as wrath or anger or rage, but it is a lot more intense than that. It implies a sort of divine sanction against violations of the right order of things. It's a punishment for hubris, essentially, and it comes down on the Achaeans and the Trojans in response to the mishandling of a priest's daughter at the beginning of. But it comes down for a variety of reasons. And that sort of presupposes hierarchy. It presupposes a divine order of things. And the last 100 years or so of our, current history, not Homer's time, but our time, has been an experiment in undermining hierarchy itself and opposing hierarchy itself. And it's like, I don't think our present situation, such as it is, can be blamed on deviation from the law of Zeus in this way. It feels like a very malicious abuse of a text whose values would be very antithetical to the values of the present. And there's an abuse there, I think. There's a, not to sound too poetic, but some necromancy, I think, where we're bringing up the dead and putting words in their mouth as if they spoke them when they didn't. I think people get upset by that, and they have every right to.
Interesting. So you think that basically Nolan has undermined and potentially deliberately misinterpreted elements of the source material, perhaps through his own doing, but also maybe as a result of using Emily Wilson's translation and having that influence potentially bleed into where the story was inspired?
When I went into the theaters to see it, I was all signals go. I was on the lookout for any sign of Emily Wilson. I didn't see any. Emily Wilson. I had been hearing for 6 months, like, oh, he's based this off Emily Wilson. And I'm like, oh yeah, I'm gonna freaking hunt this down. I've read Emily Wilson's text. I know the changes she made, and I didn't see any of it. Odysseus is not a liar. He is not some psychopathic killer. Telemachus is not a bratty child. The suitors are depicted as very much deserving their own death and bringing it on themselves. The comrades, his shipmates, are not depicted as victims of Odysseus's bad leadership. They're very clearly shown to be at fault and bringing their own suffering on themselves. Odysseus has this line. It's like, I'm not the enemy. I was trying to save you, as they're sitting there eating the cattle he told them not to eat. One of the big bugaboos of Wilson was the 12 faithless housemaids at the end, the traitorous housemaids who betrayed Penelope and Telemachus and aided the suitors and also slept with them and these sorts of things. And they were not depicted in the film. You would expect a feminist film to show the violence done to women. Some people have tried to say that their absence is a sign of feminism. How would that be the case? It does show one, Melantho, who is very clearly depicted as being in the wrong, and Penelope herself basically kills her, pushing her back into the room. It's like, this is where you belong. It's very, I didn't see any of that there. The only signs of Emily Wilson's influence I could think of would be, one, the very simple dialogue, which a lot of people complained about, and also rightfully so. It was not particularly good dialogue. But Emily Wilson has a very simple, contemporary speech. And that definitely came through in the film. And also, among the many translations, they all translate lines a little bit differently, but Robert Fagles translates the last line of the introductory paragraph of the Odyssey as he's invoking the muse, and he says, "Sing for our time too." And Emily Wilson kind of one-upped Fagles a little bit. She says, "Now, muse, daughter of Zeus, goddess, daughter of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times." And I could see Nolan picking up on that and be like, how would I tell this story for our modern times? Which is not a bad line. And it's not a particularly political line. So those are the only things I could see of Wilson's influence. But Nolan's own choices are a different kind of bad. Whereas Wilson blames Odysseus for the death of all of his comrades and the death of the suitors, as well, because, of choices he made that would have brought him home to Ithaca before the suitors even went to Ithaca. Nolan says, no, he's not responsible for the death of the suitors or the death of his comrades. He's responsible for the death of the world, which is a little heavier. Wilson doesn't go that far.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is Nolan's own decision-making. And I don't think this was Nolan deliberately misreading the text or anything like this. I think Nolan had his own ideas, and he was drawing inspiration from the story, and he was trying to be faithful. The idea of Xenia he presents, he's clearly done his homework. He begins with a fairly nuanced, correct view of Xenia, but then he expands it later on. And the expansion is what cuts against the stories themselves later. But he starts off from a more or less accurate place thematically. He brings up a lot of themes of sacrifice, and there are many people who are saying this whole PTSD thing was also borrowed from Emily Wilson because of a few lines. It's not. The theme of the trauma of war and PTSD in Homer has been talked about for decades. And there's one author in particular named Jonathan Shea, who wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam in 1995, which is 20 years before Wilson. People have been talking about this for a long time. That's a legitimate thing. The problem is, in order to focus on that theme, Nolan neglected the other dimensions of Odysseus. They neglected his playful trickery. They neglected his quality as a good and entertaining guest among the Phaeacians. At no point did we see his wordplay, his clever rhetorical skills. We never saw his anger. There's this very lovely scene, sort of at the end, where he and Penelope are speaking, and she's not convinced, and she tests him by saying, "Well, I'll have the guests move Odysseus's bed out," and he's like, "Who cut down my bed? It's got a living, bedpost here," and he actually gets angry, and that's the tell. That's the tell that he's really him, and that's another. He has many sides to him, and I think with Nolan, because we only got a one-dimensional Odysseus, we sort of didn't get Odysseus. We got we got a sort of two-dimensional cutout of Odysseus, played by Matt Damon, and people really felt that absence, I think.
Yeah. It's interesting because from where I am, I'm pretty much a blank slate. I haven't read the Odyssey. I haven't even seen the movie. I don't even know much about the actual storyline of the plot or anything.
Oh,
But
I'm so jealous.
I'm curious how you got into studying Homer and like getting so deep into Greek philosophy.
Well, I mean, I started reading Homer in high school, as many people do. I remember reading the Lattimore, I think, Iliad, and I was actually not as interested in the Odyssey at the time. I was more interested in the Iliad, as a lot of young men are. Violent battles, Diomedes. Screw Achilles. Diomedes is the guy when you're an 18, 19-year-old kid. And Hector, of course. And I don't know, I loved the language and the sincerity of it all. I feel like so much of the literature we were presented with in high school was this very postmodern, very angsty, not that there's no angst in the Iliad, because there's a little bit, but I don't know. There's something about Homer that is just magical in its otherness, and yet at the same time in its familiarity. And I mean, I moved in and out of Christianity several times, growing up from high school into college and afterwards. But when I was really quite certain I was leaving Christianity, I was like, well, what's the next thing back behind that? And the next thing back is Homer. I discovered there's actually a middle point, which is Plato. But I mean, roughly speaking, Plato is sort of a bridge in many ways between Homer and Christianity. So, it was the next fallback point in terms of cultural identity and like what is the myth that guides our values, I suppose. And it is very fashionable among some people to think that they can live without myths. They're going to be scientific. They're going to be very rational. It's like, okay, well, where does that ideal of being, why is it good to be rational? Where does the obligation for science come from? Many people think science works like the way Richard Dawkins describes it, where it's like, oh, science works because computers compute and planes fly and all this. It's like, science did none of that. Engineers did that. Engineers aren't doing science, except in the loosest and most Mott and Bailey of definitions. Engineers are engineering. They're trying to figure out what works. And they, in many ways, don't even care what's true, so to speak. Engineering is an inherently pragmatic undertaking.
Yeah.
Whereas science, 99% of science is completely useless. Like, why are we studying giant squids? Why are we studying the mating habits of Amazonian tree frogs? Like, literally the most useless stuff ever. And I love that people are studying it, though. Like, it is about the pursuit of truth for its own sake, not for some instrumental value. And that comes from Socrates. Science is a Socratic hero cult, and it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. But the scientists who think that they can escape religion are undermining themselves. There is a mythic foundation to their own value system, axiomatically.
I want to bring up something incredibly interesting that I've learned about, P.F. Young, Paul, mostly a political commentator, but he has this one video about a moment that he thinks most people have missed that was a debate between Jordan Peterson and Richard Dawkins. And they were talking about the way that ideas or mimetic information spreads throughout culture across generations. And I forgot what it was called. It's a Bayesian something, where it's basically cultural ideas get embedded into the evolutionary adaptations of the species because they are useful to propagating the species. So there was a point in the debate where Dawkins and Peterson reached this point where they said Jungian archetypes and religion may be a evolutionarily adapted form of mimetic idea that has permeated throughout culture because it provides a baseline set of beliefs and values that are useful to live your life by.
Sure. Well, I mean, why else would we have ideas?
Yeah.
Right. Hopefully all the ideas we're having are useful. Well, useful for what? Well, at a base level, survival and the things you do on the other side of survival, yeah. I don't see what other purpose they could serve. It's an interesting way to think about ideas that a lot of people don't think about as a sort of symbiotic alternative organism. Where this gets really interesting, though, is one of the guys who is also in the classics world who's very critical of Odysseus. You have Emily Wilson. You also have a character who, of all the annoying people online, I would like him to be my nemesis because he's a serious and respectable guy. You want to pick your enemies, right? His name is Joel Christensen. He's a professor at Brandeis University and probably a few others. And he's written a book called Why Odysseus that basically depicts Odysseus as a scoundrel and an anti-hero and basically a criminal, more or less. And he makes the serious arguments that you can make in that sense. But he also has this argument that the stories we tell, the narratives we create, take on the biological qualities of life, and they live apart from their author, from their original teller. And this is an interesting kind of positive version of the famous Norman Barth's argument of the death of the author. Norman Barth's is more based on the experience of the reader with the text. But Christensen's argument is very similar. These stories live apart from the author. And what that does is it sets up a framework that allows us to change the story's meaning to whatever we want it to be. The problem with that, I think, is that so much of the meaning that we get from the story pertains to the author and is connected to the author even when we don't know the author. There is a famous story by Jorge Borges called The Library of Babel. And are you familiar with the story?
Sounds familiar, but
it's barely even a story, really. It's more just a setting. It's a universe, I suppose, that is a library. It is composed of these hexagonal rooms, and each room has the same number of shelves, and each shelf has the same number of books, and all of the books are 442 or something pages long. They're identical lengths, and every book is different from each other, and they all have every possible combination of letters you could possibly imagine in 400.
Yeah. There's a Library of Babel website.
Yeah. So the question is, suppose you find Shakespeare, but one letter is different. Take your combination of Shakespeare plays that would add up to 442 pages. And the one next to it is identical, but with one letter changed, and so on and so forth. At what point is it no longer Shakespeare? Or is the one that actually is Shakespeare also not Shakespeare? Because our experience of the text actually pertains to the author. This is one of the most exciting things for me about AI and seeing generative AI. Because when people make AI art, and you can make some beautiful images with AI art, just like ChatGPT, create me an image of this, and it'll do it. It'll do it better than a human can. And if you were to set up an auction, and on one hand you have a human painted image, and next to it you have an AI generated image, and you auction off the human image for $200. So, and the AI image is very similar to the human one, but it's better. How much money do you think you're going to get for the AI made image?
It depends on if you tell people.
You tell people. You tell people this is an AI generated image. It's like the human one, but a little bit better. How much money do you think people will pay for that? $200 for
probably not based on public discourse at the moment.
I think maybe 5.
Yeah,
if you're
most people
lucky.
hate AI.
They have no interest in it because there's no meaning behind it on the other side of understanding the author. And I think the beautiful thing about generative AI is that it has revealed the death of the author in our experience of art. We actually care a lot about the author. The author,
Except when it's inconvenient, perhaps.
well, yeah, we can invoke arguments against the necessity of the author's intent where we want it to be. And like Norman Barth's argument is a little bit more nuanced. We're doing a gloss for a podcast. He doesn't say it's not there at all, but he does say that it's not like the final authority of the meaning of the text. And the opening of his essay is the description of like, there's this hierarchy. You're reading a story. There's a character saying something. Is that the character's voice? Or is it the author's voice in the character? Or is it the culture's voice speaking through the author into the character? Or is it some outside larger historical force speaking into the culture, speaking into the author, speaking through the character, and so on? And all of these different voices merge into a composite that is the experience of the reader. And it's kind of a compelling argument when you first hear it.
Not to mention, there's another interesting piece to this, which is that the reader brings their own context and interpretation to the experience of reading the book.
Yes, they do.
So every single time you read a book, you're a different person, and your experience of reading it is different. Like, this is one of the biggest problems, I think, that comes with religious texts, is that
Heraclitus reads books.
If you imagined that, say, the Bible was in fact the literal word of God and was the literal truth, you would have no way of accessing that because your interpretation of the book is going to be different every time you read it, let alone any time someone else reads it.
This is one of my current projects. There is a philosopher and a theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher, who's actually referenced in Emily Wilson references him in her introduction to her translation. He was a theologian who was concerned with this. Back in the 1800s, you had a field called philology that almost no one talks about anymore. It's about the interpretation of texts. Friedrich Nietzsche defined philology as the art of reading slowly. One of Greg Nage's, one of my favorite academics today, one of his colleagues was asked what he does for a living. He said he was a philologist, and the lady was like, "What does a philologist do?" And he paused, and he looked very unhappy. He was like, "I just look things up." And that was his definition of philology. It's not bad as far as it goes. But Schleiermacher was not satisfied with philology as a study for exactly the reason you said. I'm simplifying this a little over much, but he realized exactly what you were describing, this Heraclitus problem of we are not the same reader as we approach this text as someone from 200 BC or something. Or maybe we're not the same person as we ourselves were yesterday. And so the presence of the reader creates a new dimension in the task of understanding. And so he created a field which is called hermeneutics. And my very rough, simplified version is philology is the science of the meaning of the text in itself, whereas hermeneutics is, Schleiermacher called it the science or the art of understanding. I think the better way to think about it is like the science of the meaning of a text to the reader. And it involves some Socratic self-knowledge, that you have to understand yourself in order to understand the biases you're bringing to the text, not so that you can create something of your own and pass it off as what Shakespeare said or what Homer said. But you can know yourself so that you can better triangulate away yourself, and so that you can better get at and understand the source material with yourself temporarily set aside, so to speak. But yeah, hermeneutics has been an interesting rabbit hole in its relation for exactly the reasons you described.
Mm-hmm. So a big part of your draw to Greek philosophy and Homer in general was like sort of the transcendental quality of myths.
Well, my first love was really philosophy. My first love was the questions of wisdom and how do I live a good life. I remember framing it. My wife still makes fun of me to this day for it. As a teenager, I decided I didn't want to mislive and want to live a life I was going to regret. And that led to some particular choices of joining the military and studying certain things. And, you spend enough time in philosophy and you come to realize philosophy is really, really good at picking apart bad arguments. It's really, really good at identifying, how much French am I allowed to say on this podcast? Or are we?
Oh, you can
keep
swear
it
as
clean?
much as you want.
It's really good at identifying bullshit. Philosophy is not very good at creating things. It's not very good at building things up. This was ironically Nietzsche's big criticism of Socrates. He says Socrates' instinct was to tear down, but when he wanted to create, had to be conscious. Whereas when he says normal, healthy men create unconsciously, but it takes conscious effort to tear down or to criticize. It's ironic because Nietzsche's best writing was all extremely critical as well. His attempts at creation were not as good as his philosophizing with a hammer, as he put it. But you realize philosophy can kind of only take you so far. And what's on the other side of that is art and poetry. Poiesis means creation, basically. And it's like, well, there's Homer again. That's the creative energy and the creative genius behind our entire civilization for the last 2,800 years, including Christianity, interestingly enough. And, I like to joke with my friends that there's this triangle of green grass yards separated by fences where the starving artist is always envious of the businessman who makes a lot of money. The businessman almost always past a certain point decides to get into philosophy. They want to become a philosopher. George Soros always cracks me up because he wrote this book called The Alchemy of Finance, and what he asserts in the very final paragraph of that book is his own theory of reflexivity as the dialectical synthesis of Hegel and Marx. Like, what a grandiose statement. And it doesn't quite work. But it's like, in there is a desire of a guy who was a financier and was not quite satisfied with that. He really wanted to be a philosopher. And, you see something similar with Nassim Taleb, except I think Nassim Taleb has been more successful in his attempt to be an amphibian. I think he is a serious philosophical thinker in many ways, and a successful financier, more successful than me. And then of course the philosophers reach a certain point and they want to get into music or art.
Mm-hmm.
Like they find that dissatisfying too. And so there's this endless cycle of philosophy, art, business, philosophy, art, business. And, it's probably best to be some kind of balance between the three, I would imagine.
Yeah, as with most things. But the problem with balance, one of my favorite mottos or I guess sayings I try to embed in my philosophy is something I strive towards is balance without moderation.
Something I strive towards is balance without moderation. What do you mean?
I think there's this assumption within balance that it's a leveling out, it's an averaging things, and that if I'm balancing two things, then I'm giving less effort to both. And that can be true maybe when you're splitting yourself in multiple directions at one given time. But if you're working on multiple different things across different time horizons, you can actually do this thing and that thing and that thing, as long as you're not trying to do it all at once, all at the same time.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think some of the most successful guys I know, and the most interesting and multifaceted guys I know, didn't get there by slowly developing 6 different skills at once. They went through phases of eccentric, radical obsession. They obsess with this for 3 years, and then all right, I'm done with that. And then they move on to something else, and they obsess with that for some time. And I don't think that's sustainable in your later years, but it's not unhealthy in your early years, I don't think, to do that. And I mean, even Aristotle, the philosopher of moderation and finding that mean, says it often makes sense to overshoot the mean, to correct. If you're deficient in something, it might make sense to go a little bit extreme in order to compensate and find that middle point. Yeah, that totally makes sense. But I think there is we mentioned Alex Hormozy earlier. There is, I mean, just in the language of maxing that we hear from Gen Z guys today, to sort of romanticize the extremes, to romanticize the single-minded heroes who, I'm going to be the pull-up guy. I'm going to be the running guy. I'm going to be the Greek philosophy guy. I'm going to be the X guy. I'm going to be the best in the world that no one ever was. I'm going to catch them all. I'm going to whatever it is. And there is, first of all, there's a tremendous cost there. But second of all, these skills often play off each other, and some of the best creative acts don't come from extreme specialization, but come from the stacking of a few sometimes surprising and unlike skills in combination. Scott Adams was my favorite political commentator while he was alive, and he was a cartoonist with a background in business, and he was a hypnotist. And he brought his background in hypnotism in understanding rhetoric and political language, and news language. And it was very valuable, but it fit in with his professional humor and his business background. And it's a very odd combination, And so, I mean, maybe Robert Heinlein was exaggerating when he says, specialization is for insects. A man should be able to lead an invasion, change a diaper, cook a hamburger, freaking whatever the list was. But it is good to be polytropos, to have multiple dimensions and aspects to yourself, and not to be a man of one thing.
I think that's interesting. You said the accumulation of a bunch of different skills leading into one particular thing. That's almost exactly what I've done with podcasting. Looking back across all the different interests I had throughout middle school and high school, that seemed to be totally different paths. I was really into music production at one point, and then I was really into game design, and I was really into math and coding, and I was really into making short films in middle school or whatever. All those little bits and pieces have come back together into something like podcasting, which requires somewhat of a multifaceted, knowledge of video production, audio production, video editing, all sorts of different things. Communication skills being one of the main things, obviously.
Right.
But it's just interesting how, looking back, life doesn't make sense as you're living through it, but it makes sense as you look back.
Yes.
And I'm curious, looking from where you are now, you're an electrician by day, philosopher by night. Now you're growing your online social media presence as this Greek philosopher, caffeine and philosophy. You have all these incredibly detailed and nuanced takes on all the different intricacies of everything. It's just you can, as soon as you see your page, just immediately, the first impression I get is wow, this guy knows a lot about all this stuff. This is insane. He just pulls it out that. I'm curious, for you looking back, what are some of the things that you didn't realize were bringing you to where you are now that now you can see we're like a part of that.
It's funny you said earlier it doesn't make sense going forward, but it makes sense in reverse. If there's a logical progression from one thing to another, then of course it makes sense. It has to make sense because your interest didn't come from nowhere. It had to follow from something that came before.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you mentioned me being an electrician. I wasn't an electrician who discovered philosophy. I was a philosopher who discovered Robert Pirsig and Matthew Crawford. And Robert Pirsig
interesting.
and Matthew Crawford convinced me that I should not be an academic and that the superior philosophical path is to work with my hands. You are another Zen and the Art of Motorcycle fan, which is wonderful, wonderful novel. There is a philosopher named Matthew Crawford, contemporary writer, great Substack follow, by the way. And his first book was called Shop Class's Soulcraft. And he's written subsequent books. The World Beyond Your Head is, in my opinion, a masterpiece on attention. And his follow-up book to that, Why We Drive, is really like a polemic against autonomous cars and defense of self-locomotion in general. But Shop Class's Soulcraft really, really persuaded me of the moral and epistemic value of physical work and cultivating a relationship with the material of the world and not just with ideas. And I mean, his background was he got his PhD in like the history of political thought or something like that. Worked at a think tank for 6 months, hated it with every fiber of his being, quit, opened up a motorcycle repair shop in West Virginia. And it's very similar in many ways to something Robert Pirsig. You can see the through line of the spirit there. And I mean, at the end of the day, philosophy is about the good life. It's about what, Camus would say it's first, is life worth living? But on the other side of, if you are still with us on the assumption that you think, yeah, actually life is worth living. Okay, well, what is the good life then? And I don't think a life in academia, by itself is a very good life. There's a detachment. You look at them and I didn't want to be that. I wanted to be a different kind of person. And so being an electrician after some time as a truck driver and an exterminator was more the kind of person I wanted to be in terms of skill with hands and being able to work with physical objects, fixing things, building things, all that. It's very gratifying. It's not as lucrative as other things, but the world is full of extremely wealthy people who are very dissatisfied. So, yeah, the philosophy came first and the trades came second. I'm sorry, I missed the question though.
Interesting. No, it's I think that's curious. I mean, it makes sense, but also it's interesting, the connection with Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. The question was just around like looking back, what are the things in your past that you didn't realize at the time were leading towards where you are now that in retrospect you can see were one of those like founding elements?
I think probably the biggest one was losing my faith in Christianity in my October of my junior year in high school. I remember it very vividly. And it was kind of a long time coming, but that was when I finally like acknowledged it, that I didn't believe anymore. And that was very rapidly followed with a fairly intense anger at my family and the other people of my church who had brought me along on this theological ride so carelessly. Like, I wasn't mad at God. If anything, I was like, I wanted to believe, but I just couldn't anymore at that point. But I felt embarrassed that I had been that I had been persuaded to say these things and to care about these things by people who themselves did not act like they cared about it at all. You're saying that the creator of the universe loves you personally, and nothing else in the world matters. And this is something you care about for 2 hours a week on a Sunday. That's absurd. That's crazy. If you believe that's real, that should be your entire life, you know? And so that probably, if I'm to reverse engineer myself, that was probably a pretty formative thing in my concern for arguments and philosophy and what's true and false and all of that. I've become a lot softer in some ways with Christianity since those days. There was like a 3-year gap between that loss of faith and entering my angry new atheist phase. A lot of guys who lose faith have to pass through that period where you're quoting Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and all that. Yeah, probably losing my Christian faith in high school was a big part of it. Although I did go to a philosophy camp at the University of Washington when I was 11, so that might have had an effect.
Yeah. Do you think losing your faith was mostly theological and philosophical, or?
Yeah. There was a video I saw in middle school that really, no, it was early high school, that stuck with me. It took a couple of years to really have its effect. It was like a sort of a time delayed reaction, but it was talking about the efficacy of prayer. And it contrasted this Christian website that was saying God answers prayer in 3 ways. He says yes, no, or wait. And it said, this milk jug also answers prayers in exactly the same way. Yes, no, or wait. And that comparison and the realization that, all of the apologetics around God I was exposed to were basically covering over nothing at all. It became very disconcerting that so many people were so attached in their identity to this illusion, you know. And so yeah, it was definitely theological. There were some personal experiences too. Like I had an experience in also in high school where I thought I heard the voice of God telling me something. And so I did that, and it wasn't particularly important. It was like sending out one of those super embarrassing, like feel good chain email things that were all of like the thing. They were like the first generation of spam mail. And I made an error in the send list, and I accidentally referred to someone in quotes by a recognizable name. And my friend called me out in the respond to all because I just sent to all. I didn't know what I was doing, you know? And he's like, Chris, it's not cool to do this in a response to all, because I'd sent it from an anonymous email. I was so embarrassed. And I was like, it's so firmly disproved for me, the idea that such a stupid and tasteless, harmless, but idea could have come from God. Like, obviously not. But then why did I think that voice I heard in my head was God telling me to do that? And that led into a sort of questioning the experience of my own like mind, basically. Because many people will talk this way. Many Christians will talk this way. Oh, we've been called to this place over here. We really feel like we're being called to go change jobs or something. It's like, that's you. That's not you being called by God. You've attached a label to a part of your own internal thought process, and you've attached a particular voice to that thought process, and you call the part of your thoughts that speak with that voice God. And they don't realize they're doing it. You can manufacture this actually completely artificially if you read a book and you get really, really attached to one of the characters, then you become so familiar with their lines and the way that the character thinks that you can generate what they would say in your head, like, what would Aragorn do? And you can imagine Viggo Mortensen's voice saying, it is not for us to, or whatever. Morgan Freeman's, of course, the easy one.
Yeah.
But like that capacity, once I saw that in myself, seeing it sort of dropped the veil on my eyes on the legitimacy of that kind of claim as evidence for something. And this is not just Christianity. This is something I run into with people who talk about they have a mushroom experience and they see how the world really is. Really? Like, do you think that's real because it felt profound? Is the feeling of profundity the same as truth? You can have that feeling of profundity with other interpretations that are antithetical to this. Different drugs, for example, ayahuasca and mushrooms don't give the same trip. They don't give the same experience. Different drugs give different experiences with often very equal levels of profundity. And so, this is true in many places. And I think it highlights the importance of the tools of philosophy and analyzing these things. Not that philosophy is sufficient, because it's not. You need that creative inspiration, that irrational or pre-rational desire and motivation for there to be anything at all. But people will often make philosophical claims based on these experiences. And I think it's a blind spot that many people have. It's very easy for them to find it in other people, but hard to see it in themselves.
Interesting. This is a very live edge for me because I've been atheist most of my life.
Mm-hmm.
Grew up secular. Had the same Richard Dawkins face throughout high school. And then got deeper into philosophy and was like, okay, well, I'll just call myself agnostic because I'm not going to say I'm certain. And over the past year or two, I've just been more and more spiritually curious about the convergence between different ideas, between many different aspects of Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, and even like secular meditation and how that like bridges into it as well through, descriptions of enlightenment or whatever.
Yeah.
And I'm at a point now where I'm at this weird crossroads because I feel like I act as if I believe in something, but I don't know what that thing is, and I don't know how I would describe that relationship to people. And I also don't know, like the blind spot thing you mentioned, I feel like there's a part of me that wonders if the deeper I get into spirituality, the more I'm creating a blind spot in my mind that is just a comfortable story I'm telling myself.
Well, I mean, that if we're to follow the blind spot metaphor biologically, I mean, you can't get rid of your blind spot. You can move it around a little bit, but you'll always have a blind spot.
Yeah.
But I think that desire for spirituality of some sort is, that's really real. And
God-shaped hole.
was it Aristotle, I think, who said the man who can live alone is either a beast or a god. Like, we all long for connection. And I mean, my favorite definition of spirituality is just connection with a spirit. Right? Which spirit is that? I think one is hard pressed to find better candidates than the greats of the past, the heroes of the past, people like Achilles or Odysseus, or their storytellers like Homer, or the great minds like Plato or Nietzsche or these other people. But also the people in our lives, our family, our friends, neighbors, even people who don't seem like great.
In a historical sense,
yeah. And composite forces can emerge from a lot of like lesser mortals like ourselves. Like, there can be a spirit of a neighborhood that you are either in touch with or not. But to bring back to the Odyssey, one of Odysseus's great superpowers is his nous, his mind. But nous is not just mind. It refers to mind, but it also refers to his mental connection with other people. This is something I'm borrowing from Greg Nosh, the Harvard philologist. And you see it in the opening lines. Many cities of men he saw and came to know their minds. And that knows, that minds that he is recognizing in other people and coming to know, is also his mind. And it's what gives him power. So it's what gives him cunning, his understanding of how to work with people, or how to use them in some cases. But it's also the anchor, his connection to home, his connection to Penelope, to Ithaca, to Telemachus. That is also his nous that his comrades do not have. There's a word that is used to describe his comrades in the opening lines, nepioi, which is usually translated as fools, or translated as idiots, or children, like children in not knowing things. Greg Nosh translates that as disconnected, which I think is very interesting. They're disconnected from home. They've forgotten it. Maybe they ate the lotus flowers, or maybe they became so obsessed with heroism and glory that they were willing to die and never make it home, which is a real danger. So that mental connection, I think, is part of our condition as humans, and that longing for connection. And in the absence of gods or heroes, we are kind of floating in the void. We are in Nietzsche's death of God void. And the question, of course, at the end, Jordan Peterson likes to misquote Nietzsche on this and be like, Nietzsche was very sad about this. It's like, Nietzsche was declaring war on Christianity in other books. But he did say the death of God space, which he blamed Christianity for, was a problem. It was like, we need to create new funeral games. What new rituals, what new things will we do to create our own meaning in this space? And I think that's what a lot of people are looking for. And it's one of the reasons I've done the somewhat historically crazy thing and joined a new religion that my friend Jack started. And that can sound like an extremely audacious thing to do, and maybe it is. There's a kind of comfort in doing what's like tried and true, what's traditional and everything. But I like to think, if I was a Christian, that I would have been among the first disciples, that my care for the truth and the value of the matter would exceed my feeling about other people's opinions of its propriety, And I think, Christianity started with 12 and then became however many billion it is now, 2 or 3 billion. We've got more than 12, the syncretism of solar idealism tries to draw from many different traditions and say, okay, what is generally true in all of the religious traditions that we admire the most? What are the commonalities between, for example, the Rig Veda, Gilgamesh, and the Odyssey? Are there through lines? Well, it turns out there is. There's an embrace of our mortality, somewhat less than willingly in Gilgamesh, but it's there, very, very explicitly in the Odyssey and in the Rig Veda, as well, which is older than the Iliad, not quite as old as Gilgamesh. And from these, you can sort of triangulate the common patterns of what is real and what is wise and the nature of the gods. And what solar idealism has sort of arrived on is there are essentially 3 gods. There are 3 kinds of gods that pop up with different names in different places, but they're essentially the same energy. They're essentially the same idea. And they're all idealized versions of ourselves. There's the Father, who creates order. He draws lines and makes laws. In the Jewish tradition, this is Yahweh, right? In Greece, this is Zeus. In Norse mythology, this is arguably Thor. It gets a little hazy, the Norse stuff. Odin comes in later. So there's the father, who's the order maker. There's the striker. This is very much Thor. It's also Apollo. And the striker is the warrior god. He's the knight who strikes down the dragon and slays the serpent. And then there is that's a very different energy. It's a different personality. In Christianity, this might be Archangel Michael. Some people might say it's actually Jesus himself, but Then there is an interesting and multifaceted third energy, a third god that is the Lord of the Earth. And if you think about it in terms of function, the father draws the boundaries. The striker protects those boundaries. And the Lord of the Earth cultivates and preserves the value within those boundaries. And all three of those basically describe the various different roles of men in all cases. And we can look to the gods that embody those as not just as inspiration and guidance for how to live our life, but as energies and personalities in their own right that we can connect with and we can look up to and appreciate. And it's, I think there's something to it. I think there's something beautiful in that framework, that doesn't require me to believe something that I don't believe.
Interesting. Do you know much about panpsychism?
I've heard of it. I feel like that's one of those things that I used to know a lot more about than I do now.
Yeah.
You'll have to remind me.
I don't know a ton about it, but my best understanding of it is that it's basically the theory that the universe is made of consciousness, and consciousness is a fundamental element of which life and everything else is an expression of consciousness.
Yes, I've heard
and that's
of this.
how everything's like connected in some way.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting theory. My question for the panpsychist would be: suppose panpsychism is true, how does that change how we live? There is a category of philosophical arguments that has a very long and storied history. You can kind of trace it back to Plato's allegory of the cave. It was very popular with the Matrix. You can find it in Descartes' sort of evil demon thought experiment. And most recently, you can find it in, oh my gosh, his name is escaping me, the Swedish philosopher, simulation theory. The idea that we're all living in a simulation. These sorts of ideas that the external world isn't real. These sort of, you can call them all generally like Gnostic theories, where the world is illusion. The physical world is illusion. It's all mind. And all of them are kind of unfalsifiable. The question is, what changes if you believe that? And usually it's not much. It's just a way to be like, look how smart I am. But consciousness is genuinely mysterious. It might be a problem with how we're framing it. Consciousness might be a complete mystery to us because of how we have defined consciousness. And that can be a very weird thing to contemplate. But perhaps not less weird than the weirdness of consciousness itself and the supposedly hard problem of consciousness. How can subjective experience arise from matter in the first place? There are questions as to, does panpsychism actually answer that? Because if the world is mind, well, you still run into the problem of like, where did the mind come from? Mm-hmm. Which is similar to some of the theological debates about why is there something rather than nothing in the universe. And I just like to say, I don't know. and you probably don't either.
Unanswerable, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe it always was. Yeah. It's the simulation theory argument, but Nick Bostrom's the name of it. I have come to think of the simulation argument largely as a symptom of too much time on the internet. Of people who, if you spend so much time dividing your attention between the physical world and the world of online images and pictures and words from someone you're not seeing and drama going on between people you've never met and stories about stories and so forth, your divided attention can result in you losing the experience of causality in the physical world. You're thinking about what's going on in the news, about what's going on in Syria or, wherever. You're thinking about what's going on in the football game, what's going on online. And the things in the physical world around you, because you're not paying attention to them, take on the feeling of just happening. Like you wake up and you might experience this when you drive to work and you're still very tired. You get to work and you don't recall your drive at all. You just get out of your car and suddenly you're at work. And you're like, how did I get here? I drove, but you have no recollection of it. Things just happen. That is a dream. It's a dreamlike experience. And it creates the feeling of reality not being real or yourself not being you. In clinical terms, this is called derealization syndrome or depersonalization syndrome. And I think this experience is on the rise because of the internet, because of phone use, because of people getting more and more working online rather than working with their hands, interacting online, dating online. Maybe you're not even dating a person. Maybe you're dating a chatbot, and in that world of divided attention, of course, an argument that says actually you're living in a simulation will feel correct to you because it matches your experience of the real world. But it's an unfalsifiable claim. It's just one of these things that you can sort of throw out there. And the various different Gnostic beliefs, whether you think we are, the external world is constructed by an evil demon, as Descartes, or you're living in a cave and there's, puppets throwing shadows up on a wall as in Plato's cave, or if you're living in a simulation, or if we're all just mind trapped in a flesh prison or something, they're all kind of exclusive with each other. And I just sort of assume they cancel each other out.
Yeah. So your fall from Christianity and faith, would you say you're a hardcore materialist now?
I guess it depends on what you describe as material. But to me, in the same way that Christianity fits under the broad category of monotheism, I would say solar idealism, you could loosely say, fits under the category of paganism. And paganism is a religious category of natural gods as opposed to supernatural gods. Zeus is not some supernatural being who sits on high. He is the thunder. Poseidon is the sea. And these natural forces have a kind of personality to them. And we understand them better as humans with personality tracking brains, just like we track faces better than we track fingerprints or something. I don't know. We track personalities better than we track data or something. We think, oh, the sea is angry today. That's a manner of speaking, right? But it's how we think. And so I think you can use the word spirit in a meaningful sense without believing in the supernatural. Because we have character. We are material beings. And as Nietzsche says, what is the soul if not something about the body? our character is in our body. Which another way to put this is we embody our character. So it's not that I'm a materialist to the exclusion of spirit. I just don't think there's a line of separation between spirit and material, if that makes sense.
Interesting. Well, to sidetrack a little bit,
Sure.
it was tons of fun having dinner with you and all the kids, and
Oh, sure.
I'm curious about, I'm only 21. I'm quite young, obviously, but I have dreams of being a father one day, and I'm curious, like, what being a father has taught you. I mean, 5 kids is, to some people, it seems like a lot. I don't know about by your standards, but
it
seems like a lot to me. It's fun chaos, though.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson had this line about 3 kids being the optimally difficult number. I think he's very much correct about that. When you have your first one, you're super stressed. You don't know what to do. It feels completely like, oh my God, the baby's crying. Is it dying? Is it like, what do we do? Did we break its arm? What happened to it? Why is it? Oh my gosh. By the second one, you're like, okay, I got a little bit better sense of what's going on. But it turns out the second one is way different than the first one. You're like, oh my gosh, this is not like. And the third one, they start to stack up in their difficulty. But about number 4, your veteran status really kicks in and economies of scale start kicking in. We're just batch cooking chili. You get hand-me-down clothes from this one. The books, you've got your rotation. You kind of got it all figured out. The newborn's crying. They do that. It's fine. No one's going to die. And you begin, I think the biggest thing you learn, and it's not even really learning, it's just you're reprogrammed by the experience, whether you want to or not, it happens to you. You're just not as overwhelmed and stressed by the barrage of noise and interruptions and the constant demands as you used to be.
You adapt to the environment.
Yeah, and the environment changes you. There's a danger in saying you adapt to the environment as if that's like a choice you have to make. It's better if you make that choice, but if you don't, you're going to be forced to change anyways. So no one's ready for parenthood. Parenthood makes you into the sort of person who can make it happen. Which is not to say everyone is equally ready to become a parent, obviously, but yeah, it's way less intimidating on the other side of being there than it looks from the outside.
Mm-hmm. What's something you wish someone had told you before you had kids?
This is not as relevant on the other side of having 4 or 5, but there's a substantial amount of research out there now that your parenting decisions have far less of an effect on your child as you think it will. Which does not say parenting doesn't matter, but it's not as significant as we like to imagine. Which means if you aren't atrocious, if you aren't a terrible person, if you aren't drunkenly abusing your children, and absolutely don't do that, but the kids are going to be fine. You are not messing up your kids.
Just be there and love them.
Generally. Yeah, just be there and love them. Observe them and care about them. It doesn't even have to be a lot. You don't even have to be watching their every move and spending hours and hours and hours playing puzzle. You want to do that some, but there is. I think this is especially true with women, but it hits men too. This fear that you have messed up your child in some way. And that can cause so much anxiety and fear, which oftentimes rolls downhill and affects the child. And the child is now anxious and they don't know why. It's because mom and dad are anxious. And it's all going to be fine, unless you do something that's not fine. Right. But generally speaking, hearing that, I think would have been really helpful with the first one or two. Yeah. After a while, you kind of learn it because you'll raise 4 kids and they're all really, really kind. And like at one point you get upset and you like yell at a kid or something. And then the kid's sad and you're like, oh my God, am I teaching my child to yell or something? And then your first 4 kids don't yell and the 5th one is just like screaming all the time. And you're like, okay, there's no way we taught them that. Like that was obviously in there to start with. And you begin to see and this is like the exciting thing about having more kids is, first of all, they take care of each other, which is A, useful, B, fun to watch, and C, they seem to enjoy it a lot too, when they're not fighting with each other, which is also half the time. But you get to see these little idiosyncrasies and differences emerge and develop over the years. And they're all versions of yourself, which can be very humbling. Like you see your kid say something in exactly your language and you're like, damn it. That's really annoying when they do it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of funny and fun. But yeah, I think hearing that your parenting is not going to screw them up as long as you're kind of trying. Like, obviously go more than kind of, please. But like, there's a tendency for people to think I'm not giving it 100%, therefore I'm failing them. And I think that anxiety actually leads to a lot more antinatalist tendencies. Really, people like, oh, I'm not ready to have kids. I'm like, I couldn't do it. I can't handle the stress. It's like, yeah, you can. You just don't want to, but that's fine. Yeah. So I think that anxiety is, telling people you're not going to screw up your kids would have been nice to hear.
Yeah. Do you have any questions for me? I forgot to mention it beforehand, but Andrew said I should say that before the episodes. It's like, if the guest has any questions, you can bring it up at any time.
Okay. Well, I'm curious because you've been, you're obviously, deep into, sound and film and the sort of the podcasting world and video design and all that neat stuff. It seems to me that a lot of the podcast world has really gotten into philosophy in the last 5 or 6 years. Now I'm curious, as someone who's digging into Schleiermacher and all these obscure people, what does the world of philosophy look like from your perspective, from sort of more the younger camera oriented, I'll say? I don't mean that diminutively.
I think I see what you mean. I think it comes as a natural extension of self-improvement. I think a lot of people in the podcasting world, like, one of the things you said earlier was like, I don't want to mislive. That was my initial spark for getting into self-improvement and getting into philosophy and all that too, is like, I only have this one life. How do I make sure it's good? How do I make sure I don't end up regretting a bunch of the things that I end up doing? Like, imagining like a future scenario of like my life being like totally miserable and I'm like alone and I'm like totally unfulfilled and not doing anything I want to do. And, like I'm out of shape and like I hate my day to day. I was like, how do I not have that happen?
Yeah.
So that was what sparked me into like self-improvement and getting into the gym. Getting in shape was like one of the major first things. Was like, okay, I can actually like do things and like change my life. And then, expands outwards from there into all these other areas. And then you start, I've always been philosophically oriented of just asking why, being a curious kid, and just, I love understanding things and knowing why things work the way they do. But I think the self-improvement aspect and the philosophy came first, just out of natural curiosity. And then the self-improvement aspect sort of like deepened and expanded the philosophy. And, once you get through enough of self-improvement, you kind of, you've gotten all the,
now start to apply.
You've gotten all the low-hanging fruit. You started applying things enough to the point where you're like, okay, I don't think there's too much more. Like, there's more to learn, but it's just repackagings and reframings and new mindsets and new techniques. the fundamentals of the fundamentals, and you can't.
Yeah.
There's no more basics to learn once you learn the basics. So you can play around with like the icing on the cake, but once you have the meat of self-improvement, like
it's just
you're itched for more. And then you get deeper into, all these other philosophical ideas. And then I feel like a similar thing for me is happening at the moment where it's like, there's tons of philosophy I don't know about, but I feel like there's another itch for more, which from where I am, I feel like is spirituality in some sense. And that's what I'm like curious about and looking into all these different areas.
Excellent.
But, I guess that's sort of how I see it, is like, I don't particularly notice the philosophical turn in podcasting. Do you have like some specific shows in mind that you think have gone more philosophical?
It might be just clips that pop up, and this might be my algorithm screwing with my sense of what's this is the danger, man. This is the simulation and simulacrum. The freaking perception of reality gets altered by the algorithm a little bit. Yeah, I guess it was Friedman largely. It was also, there was a really big moment for Ryan Holiday. Maybe that was more like 7 or 8 years ago. It was a while ago. He is someone I would pay money to debate. I would love to question him. I think he has done a tremendous disservice to philosophy and to
Stoicism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think of Stoicism as much as of a philosophy as it is a therapeutic tool. It's a very good therapeutic tool, especially for men who are in rough spots. Stoicism can be an absolute lifesaver.
It was one of my entryways into philosophy.
Yeah, mine as well. When I was in high school, if you'd asked me my favorite philosophical book, it would have been A Guide to the Good Life by William Irving. And it was a modern sort of recapitulation of Stoic principles and habits, the things like negative visualization and those sorts of things. Later on, I got into Seneca and Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, all that stuff. And as I got older and started to think more in terms of the metaphysical justifications behind Stoicism, and the idea of like the logos in the Stoic concept of it. And ultimately what follows from that is that there is no such thing as bad, which is a very dark view actually of the world, because everything that happens aright. That's the idea.
As nature's way. Yeah.
Yeah. Everything happens by necessity, and there is no evil in necessity. It's like, wow. All the very bad things that I have to call good
or necessary.
Well, it's the same thing.
Yeah.
What is good is necessary. What is necessary is good, rather. And like when you're in a healthy place and you're looking at Stoicism a little bit more objectively, it's there are good parts to it, but you could certainly do worse. There are far worse philosophies out there than Stoicism. But I think people who start to dig into it rather than as just, oh, I'm going to be inspired by Marcus Aurelius's very like good disposition. And that's great. Like Marcus Aurelius is a good person to be inspired by in terms of disposition. But that's sort of not what philosophy is.
Yeah.
And you'll hear this from Ryan Holiday. Like philosophy is about asking questions. It's about trying to get down to the root of these things. And you'll hear Ryan Holiday say like that philosophers don't like Stoicism because they like to ask questions. It's like, well, yeah.
So you're treating it almost as like a tool, basically, like he's using Stoicism as a utility.
Well, if you read
treating it like philosophy.
If you read his books, like The Obstacle is the Way or Stillness is Key, or I read 2.5 of his books, and I can.
I have Daily Stoic.
Okay,
which is basically a compilation of quotes.
Yeah, I mean that's basically all his books are. If you follow his page, you know his books. It's nothing but that, and it's just this amalgamation of these quotes that, if you put them next to each other, often contradict each other. There isn't a through line in terms of the spirit, and the way that they are applied is very selective. And it's like, is this about attaining a certain peace of mind, or is this about attaining material success in the world? And his books often oscillate between those two goals quite a lot. And again, this is not me trying to go after Zeno or Epictetus as like not worth reading. They are absolutely worth reading. They're great to read. Marcus Aurelius is all right too. But it's like I said, Stoicism was my entryway into philosophy as well. So I will always have a little bit of a soft spot for it. I think for some other people, Ayn Rand is their sort of entryway into philosophy. And then at some point you discover Ayn Rand was really taking all this from Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Nietzsche and maybe one or two other people. And everything Nietzsche and von Mises said is 10 times more sophisticated than what Ayn Rand said. And everything she added to them that was not theirs made the ideas worse, not better. And so it's like, okay, we can still be grateful for Ayn Rand for that step along the path. But what I particularly dislike about Holiday is his personality. Like, he is not a stoic person. To publicly berate your father in the New York Times for politically disagreeing with you, to become an obsessive political activist. My personal theory with Ryan Holiday is that he was a marketing mastermind, basically. His one really valuable book, I think, was Confessions of what was it? Trust Me, I'm Lying is the title. And I think he had a crisis of conscience. And he thought, I'm going to use my skills for good. And I'm going to use all my marketing skills to promote Stoicism. Well, the problem is the marketing skills diluted and altered the thing he was trying to promote. Mm-hmm. So I, in a way, I almost sympathize with his desires, but he's cheapened philosophy, I think, in many ways, which is sad. But it's still good to read Epictetus. It's still good to read Seneca and Marcus Aurelius. So there's that.
Do you believe in objective truth?
I have a 60-page essay attempting to answer that.
So I'm quite a pragmatist. I think transjective truth is, as an idea, I find it quite interesting.
Here's what I think. Yeah. Pragmatism is a very pragmatic way to move through the world. Yeah. I think people get caught up in a false binary between objectivism and relativism. They think if we don't assert objective truth, then we are forced to believe in relativism. And there's a middle position called subjectivism, which holds that actually if objective truth exists, which I assume it does, but I don't have access to it. I can't speak on behalf of objective truth. Who can? And saying you believe in objective truth, like that statement, doesn't move you one iota closer to the possession of it or the possession of the knowledge of the objective truth. All you have is your subjective experience. We are trapped in a subjective perspective of the world, and that's what we have to speak from. But we are perfectly entitled to say subjectively, I think my opinion is better than yours or his or hers. We are not obliged to say, well, because none of us have access to objective truth, therefore all opinions are equal. Well, that's not how I experience it.
Yeah.
And sometimes I am reminded of just how inferior my own way of doing things or thinking is to someone else. I'm like, that's also a part of my subjective experience, So I guess I assume that there is objective truth. But that's not a very helpful way to approach the world, I don't think.
Yeah. That's why I think there probably is some objective truth, but I don't think it's something that can be reached. Like, it's not like a state that you arrive and you're like, oh, we have full understanding of everything now, and this is how it is. I think it's like I see pragmatism as a way to strive towards it, but you don't like actually reach it. And seeing truth as relational as well, I think it's quite useful.
What it all comes down to, like, what are we defining as truth? As Pontius Pilate says, tisti aletheia. What is truth? Truth, as we use the word in English, is usually a translation from the Greek aletheia, which means that which is uncovered. Lethe is like the river of oblivion and forgetfulness in the underworld. Lethe is like to forget, to lose, or to cover over. And the prefix is the negation. What is uncovered, what is remembered, as Socrates might say. All truths are things we remember, not things we learn. And this goes actually back to before Socrates, to Parmenides, who says, for something to be true is for it to be eternal and unchanging and uncontingent and whole. If you understand a part of something, you don't have the truth, because the truth is the totality. A part can be misleading, So the standard for truth, and this is the meaning of aletheia in Christianity, when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the light, and everybody who believes in the truth believes in me. That is the totality. He is the absolute. And it's a standard that humans cannot access. And my belief is that when you dig into it, it's actually just a concept from language. If you define truth not as this aletheia, but as, and I forget the Greek for it, but when Aristotle speaks of truth, he doesn't speak of aletheia usually in that way. He says, what is? Truth is what is. And that's actually a very different sense of the idea than this aletheia that we see in Socrates or with Jesus. Aristotle's like just what is. Truth is what is a more, it's not technically pragmatism. You can break it down into, there is what's called coherence theory of truth, which is the truth is what is consistent with other things that are true. And so we have to have a logically consistent total worldview. Then there's a correspondence theory of truth, which is what corresponds to the world as we experience it as best we can. And finally, there's pragmatism, which is the uniquely American school of thought. It comes from Pierce. And it has, John Dewey was a pragmatist, and there's a few others too. It's a fun one. I tend towards the correspondence theory. I think it's the most, well, I think I definitionally lose out to the pragmatism, what's the most useful, but, it's what's most intellectually satisfying to me.
Okay, cool. Well, then I have one closing question for you.
Sure.
What is a question that you've never been asked that you wish someone had asked you?
Oh, man. I'm not sure. I would have said, what's your favorite Alice in Chains songs? But we got that earlier today.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm so late to the music world. I'll stumble across like System of a Down and be like, oh, these guys are so cool. And my friend will be like, Chris, they were a thing 20 years ago. How are you just discovering this now?
Yeah.
That's how I feel about like Tool. I saw my only live band performance, which was Tool here in Spokane in March of 2020. And it was the week before they shut everything down for COVID. Maynard actually had COVID at that concert. It was weird. Strange times. But got to see him live, which was cool.
Yeah, I've seen him live. It was great.
Yeah. Even with COVID. Good time. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to think of another one. I spend so much of my time answering questions.
That's fair enough.
It's hard to think of one offhand. I don't know. I would not so much flip the question, but I'm curious, what got you into photography in particular and camera work?
I mean, really, the camera work is just like, it's not the main thing for me. It's like
Okay.
the podcasting and the ideas and the sharing of the lessons and knowledge. That's the main thing.
Okay.
But the camera work is just a necessary and enjoyable part of the process that is incorporated within the podcast as a whole.
Yeah. I guess as I've moved a little bit from philosophy more into poetry and this stuff, the two have blurred together, and I've been doing, film reviews of things like Kurosawa's films, and I recently did a review of Seventh Seal, a famous Swedish film, and there's some very heavy ideas in there about death and meaning, and the film work is connected to that. The environment. I want to go full Marshall McLuhan and say like the medium is the message, but there is some of that there. There is some of that there, and
The aesthetics part of it.
Yeah, the aesthetics are not separate from the ideas of being discussed. And this was, you might enjoy this. I was talking to an acquaintance of mine who is deeply involved in the anarcho-primitivist movement of the 90s. And I asked him, I was like, who was the philosopher who really started that? Was it Ted Kaczynski? Or was it John Zerzan? Or was it, people picking up stuff being put down by Martin Heidegger or J.R. Tolkien? And he looked at me, he's like, well, actually, Kaczynski had his criticisms of anarcho-primitivism, but he's like, John Zerzan came around afterwards. It actually started as a punk music offshoot. And it started as a musical movement, as a subculture. And then the philosophers were attracted to that and they came along for the ride. The art actually leads the way, not the philosophy. And I think that's true with the plastic arts, sculpture, and painting. I think it's true of music. I think it's true of film and photography. And I think understanding that and the combination of the ideas with the aesthetic experience opens up a whole world of experience that many people are walking around oblivious to. And it's a wonderful thing to open up that door and see the different dimension of everything around you. So yeah, that's been a fun experience.
Well, thank you for being here. It's been a great conversation.
Hope I didn't talk too much. Thanks so much for interviewing me. It's been a pleasure.
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed the topics of atheism and spirituality in this episode, then I think you'll really enjoy this solo episode I did recently, where I talked about my own spiritual journey.